Hello, and welcome to this lesson on the church at Smyrna, subtitled The Suffering Church. And I'll read about this in Revelation chapter 2, verses 8 through 11. I'd like to give a quick outline of what I'll try to cover in this lesson today. So first, I'll read the text. Then I'd like to give you some historical information about Smyrna, because that church, that city, is not mentioned explicitly anywhere else in the Bible, and so I'd like us to know a little bit about Smyrna and its history. And then I'll talk about Judaism and history, because the passage talks about the Jews, and then of course Christianity in Smyrna. And then I'll give a verse by verse walkthrough, followed by application and a challenge for us. So let me read the text first, starting in chapter 2 of Revelation, verse 8. And unto the angel of the church in Smyrna write, These things saith the first and the last, which was dead and is alive. I know thy works and tribulation and poverty, but thou art rich. And I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews, but are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that ye may be tried, and ye shall have tribulation 10 days. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. He that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death. So this is a map of Smyrna here. As you can see, that it was a seaport city in Asia Minor. The name Smyrna has the same origin as the word Smyrna, a Greek goddess. Also is related to the word Samornia, Samonia, or Samarinia, which is the name given to the southeast section of the city of Ephesus, which is nearby. And yet another possible connection with the word Smyrna is the ancient Semitic word mar, as well as the Greek word Smyrna. Both Hebrew and Greek words mean bitter and refer to the resin produced by the thorny shrub or tree named the Commiphora myrrha. This resin is produced by inflicting wounds in the tree, making deep incisions into the trunk. The tree produces resin in reaction to injury or attack in an attempt to protect the wound and facilitate healing. The resin has antibacterial, antifungal, antiseptic, and antiparasitic properties, but it also emits a very fragrant, very aromatic fragrance, I should say, when it's crushed, though. Myrrh was used for medicinal reasons, as a perfume and in embalming. The Bible has numerous references to myrrh. In Exodus chapter 30, verse 23, God requires it as an ingredient in the sacred anointing oil. And myrrh, Smyrna, is one of the gifts the wise men gave Jesus in Matthew 2:11. You can read about that. It was mingled with sour wine and offered to help dull Jesus' intense pain during his crucifixion in Mark 15:23. After Jesus died, Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes for wrapping Jesus' body. Now, according to Dr. Joseph Stowell of Cornerstone University, Smyrna had the exclusive rights to the import and export of myrrh. So this myrrh, according to him, probably came from Smyrna. Various historians and poets of antiquity, such as Herodotus, Mimnerus, and Aelius Aristides, suggest that Smyrna was founded around 1046 BC. It was conquered by the Ionians around 750 BC, and Smyrna was destroyed again in 580 BC by King Alyattes of Lydia. In 546 BC, it was dismantled yet again when King Cyrus of Persia utterly defeated the Lydians. In spring 334 BC, Alexander the Great had a dream that two goddesses instructed him to build a new city called Smyrna. Well, in 290 BC, his successor, Lysimachus, had it rebuilt to even greater splendor than ever. And around that time, the city enjoyed peace and independence as part of the Seleucid empires. As part of the Seleucid Empire, it was one of the wealthiest, most beautiful cities in all of Asia Minor, being on an important crossroad of land and sea routes to Greece, Europe, Palestine, and Egypt. Smyrna was one of the biggest trade centers in the region. In 188 BC, the Seleucids were ousted from Ionia and Asia Minor, so the region, well, it became unstable during the war between Rome and Macedonia. Smyrna firmly allied itself with Rome. In 195 BC, it sealed its alliance with Rome by becoming the very first city to build a temple to the goddess Roma. From 63 BC to 14 AD, Smyrna again enjoyed peace and prosperity under Caesar Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. And around 6 BC, the geographer Strabo stated that Smyrna is the finest of all cities. That's what he said. Smyrna always made a huge show of its loyalty to Rome and to the emperors. After Caesar Augustus died in 14 AD, Smyrna built a temple in honor of his successor, Tiberius. Well, a little bit later in 26 AD, they decided to put up a temple in honor of Augustus. And there was even a special cult dedicated to Caligula, and that's Tiberius' successor. During Emperor Domitian's reign, which is 81 to 96 AD, Smyrna remained loyal to Rome and enjoyed good relations with Ephesus, which was the capital of Asia Minor at the time, as well as Pergamum and Sardis. They had good relations with those towns as well. And even though Domitian's administration was so harsh that his own people assassinated him, during his reign, emperor worship was required by law under threat of death. Of course, the people of Smyrna had no problem with that. They were all too happy, having already constructed temples for various emperors already. The rise of the power of the Emperor Nerva, 96 to 98, as well as his successor, Emperor Trajan, who reigned 98 to 117, well, this ushered in almost a century of imperial peace, economic prosperity, and really high culture. Smyrna received gifts and large sums of money from the emperor. I should say emperors plural because it was many of them. Around 50 AD, the Greek philosopher Apollonius of Tyana, he claimed that Smyrna was the finest city under the sun. And the Roman author Pliny the Elder, who lived 23 to 79, described Smyrna as the light of Asia. And this Greek orator, Aelius Aristides, I mentioned a moment ago, he vividly describes the city's splendor. He says, Smyrna extended over the sea. Its magnitude is a source of beauty. The whole city up to the coast is occupied with gymnasia, agoras, theaters, sacred enclosures, ports. It had broad streets paved with stone slabs. Many of the streets were named after temples, and one street called the Golden Way passed from east to west, from temple to temple, hill to hill, along a single avenue even finer than its name. Its water system included at least 3 aqueducts, and it was very sophisticated for the time. The city's Acropolis was set on Mount Pagus, and it resembled a crown. Close to the southern wall of the city, between Mount Pagus and the sea, was the stadium, and the seats of honor enjoyed a magnificent view over the sea. This is where Polycarp was murdered. Northwest of the Acropolis, well, there was a Greek theater built in the times of Lysimachus, so that was around 290 BC, and it was reconstructed again probably around 50 AD. Aristides said that there were various theaters for staging of shows, musical performances, and public assemblies of citizens. In addition to these theaters, Smyrna also had an auditorium called the Odeon, which was another place for musical performances as well as readings of poetry. Aristides also tells us that Smyrna had many baths. These were mineral baths, and Strabo reports that Smyrna possessed a library. Smyrna was an internationally renowned center of teaching and research. It had a medical school in which Galen, now he was a physician who lived from 129 to into the 3rd century, like 200 or 216 AD. So Galen himself attended this school for his training. There were at least 2 intellectual societies in Smyrna. One of them was called the Homerion, which studied the life and work of Homer, who was possibly born in Smyrna. And then another intellectual society is the Mimnermaion, I guess is how you would pronounce that. And this rendered homage to Mimnermus, an ancient Greek poet who wrote a poem on ancient Smyrna. The city had numerous scholars who were well versed in a wide variety of disciplines. Theon of Smyrna, for example, he lived 70 to 135 AD. He wrote a book on mathematics, like a Neoplatonist mathematics, and it shows how arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy are interrelated. One of the main attractions of the city was its elite school of rhetoric, which had the most renowned thinkers of the day, and it attracted the top students from all over Asia Minor and as far away as Egypt, Assyria, and Phoenicia. This school was the principal center of the Roman Empire's greatest cultural and literary movement. This is called the Second Sophistic, and this dominated higher education at that time and place. The wealthiest, most elite members of society, including Emperor Hadrian, sent their sons to be educated there. No other type of intellectual could compete with these sophists in popularity and prestige. Emperor Trajan, Hadrian, and Antoninus bestowed many luxuries upon the sophists of Smyrna. In the winter of 123 to 124 AD, Emperor Hadrian visited Ephesus and Smyrna, and the people of Smyrna decided to adore Hadrian as Olympic Zeus and savior of the whole human race. They erected a temple in his honor. In return, Hadrian granted Smyrna exemption from taxes. So that was a nice deal. Towards the 2nd and 3rd centuries, getting into, I'd like to talk about now, this was still in the 1st century, but I want to talk about the Judaism in Smyrna. We get a picture of the extraordinary wealth, prosperity, the economic boom, and then the high culture and the highly educated people, this kind of reputation of Smyrna. Well, how do the Jews fit into this? What are they doing there? And how do they fit into all this? And so in the 1st, 2nd, and getting into the 3rd centuries, we do have a population of Jewish people in Smyrna. They made up about 15% of the population. Now, the Roman Empire was affable towards Jews. They had a pretty decent relationship. Under Julius Caesar's decree from around 47 BC, the Jews were exempt from military service, and they had permission to observe all their religious ordinances freely, their festivals and their laws. And among many of the freedoms that Jews enjoyed throughout the empire was active proselytizing. Now, it's nowhere near what Christians would do, but they were allowed to share their faith with other people. In 66 AD, this kind of changed a little bit here because the First Judean-Roman War erupted. Jericho was destroyed in 68 AD, and then, of course, the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in the year 70 AD. To prevent future uprisings, Jerusalem was renamed, and Jews were forbidden to live there. Many Jews immigrated to Asia Minor, and a lot of those settled in Smyrna. Despite their strong presence in Asia Minor, their relationship with the Roman Empire, well, it was not very good, needless to say. Nevertheless, they still maintained an active part in the life and culture of the city there at Smyrna. They had large synagogues, and some of these could hold up to 1,000 people. The fall of the temple and other events in the Jews' history, well, it resulted in them having a sharp decrease in tolerance for Gentiles and especially anyone converting to Christianity from Judaism. They just did not tolerate that at all. And in fact, the 12th of their 18 blessings that they recited every day, it included a curse on Christians. And this is part of it. For the apostates, let there be no hope. Let the Nazarenes and heretics be destroyed in a moment, and let them be blotted out of the book of life and not be inscribed together with the righteous. And since the 18 blessings were read publicly in the synagogue 3 times every day, well, a Christian immediately felt the reproach of those around him, of course. Well, that gets me to my next point, is Christianity in Smyrna. Well, how do they fit in to this place and that time? The Apostle Paul introduced Christianity to Smyrna maybe around 52 A.D., in the 50s. In Acts chapter 19, Luke tells us that Paul passed through the upper coasts on his way to Ephesus, and he boldly shared the gospel there for 2 years, so that all they which dwelt in Asia Minor heard the word of the Lord Jesus, both Jews and Greeks. You can read about that in verse 10 of Acts chapter 19. Now, it doesn't specifically say Smyrna, but he does say all of Asia Minor. And if you look at the map, you can see, well, the way that he would have gone through, and I'll show you another map in a moment that shows you one of his missionary journeys. You can see that he probably passed through there. Now, there's another source from the 3rd century. We don't know who wrote it. It's an anonymous book. It's entitled The Life of Polycarp. And this book states that Paul visited Smyrna when he came down from Galatia. This writer goes on to tell us that Paul stayed in Smyrna as a guest of Strateus, who was a son of Eunice, and that would make him the brother of Timothy. Both the Life of Polycarp and the Apostolic Constitutions, which is from 375-380 A.D., indicate that Timothy's brother Strateus was the first pastor of Smyrna, just as Timothy was the first pastor of Ephesus. So, like I said, a Christian community in Smyrna probably originated around 53, 56 A.D., around in that time. Now, I promised you I'd show you a map of Paul's missionary journey. This is his 3rd one here, and I've circled Smyrna there. So when Paul left Ephesus in 56 A.D., you can see it's a little bit south of Smyrna, he was on his way back to Macedonia and ultimately headed back to Jerusalem. You can read about this in Acts 19:21. He probably passed through Smyrna at that time, and since it was on the most commonly used route. Well, in 64 A.D., Nero blamed the Christians for the Great Fire of Rome, and this triggered a wave of persecution that rippled throughout the empire, lasting for, almost 250 years, up till the Council of Nicaea, around in that time period. Around 64 to 67, Peter wrote his first epistle. 1 Peter 1 addresses Christians scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, so Asia Minor, and Bithynia. And so you can see a lot of those names right here on this map. Peter is addressing these Christians scattered throughout these areas. And he's offering encouragement to Christians undergoing trials of their faith. That's in 1 Peter 1:8. So Polycarp, one of the pastors of the church in Smyrna, and he was a disciple of the Apostle John, by the way, he drew on Peter's epistle when he wrote his letter, which is entitled To the Philippians. And he wrote that letter, Polycarp wrote that letter, we're not exactly sure, but maybe as early as 108 A.D., possibly as late as 130 A.D. And it suggests that 1 Peter was probably read in Smyrna, that the pastors of the church there would have read that to the people. So this is a background behind Smyrna and the Jews there and the Christians there. Now I want to go verse by verse through Revelation chapter 2, Yes, verses 8 through 11. So, and to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, this is verse 8, these things saith the first and the last, which was dead and is alive. Jesus refers to himself as the first and the last. And he does this in Revelation 1:11, 1:17, here in 2 verse 8, as well as 22 verse 13 of the book of Revelation. And he's relating himself to time and eternity. And you'll notice, because of these 4 different citations up here, notice that he doesn't describe himself this way to any of the other 7 churches, only to the church of Smyrna. And so, yes, his description of himself as he who became dead and is alive. Notice it's not became dead but is alive. Became dead and is alive. This would have really resonated with the Christians of Smyrna because their city had been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. Remember, I said this in their long history, destroyed, rebuilt, and made even better. So they could really relate to what he's saying here. And again, this comment, dead and alive, he doesn't say that to any of the other churches. This is a message just for those people in Smyrna. His description of himself here, and in his messages to each of the other churches too, relates specifically to his message for the church at Smyrna. So he's eternal. He overcame death. The Christians of Smyrna will overcome death, and they will not be hurt of the second death. You see, so he describes himself, and then that relates to what he's going to say to that particular church. Going on to verse 9, I know thy works, and tribulation, and poverty, but thou art rich. And I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. Now this verse is loaded. So there's a lot of terms here, and so I want to go through these. In his message to each of the 7 churches, Jesus says, I know. And he's meaning I am aware of. He's telling the Smyrnians that he's aware of their persecution. To everyone except for the Jews and Christians, the emperor was God. Worshipping the emperor was required by law, remember? And of course, the people of Smyrna, they were passionate about that. You didn't have to twist their arm to get them to worship the emperor. They were all too happy to do it, and the emperor lavished upon them all kind of rewards and made them exempt from taxes. These people had a heart for worshiping the emperor, so making it a law, no problem to the people of Smyrna, but the Jews and Christians didn't feel that way. So you can see how they fit into this. Well, they didn't. Burning incense to the emperor once each year was required by law. Well, I can see the people of Smyrna lining up, happy to do it, trying to cut in front of each other. Probably anyone found in violation of this law would be imprisoned, and in some cases they'd be executed by wild beasts or burning at the stake. Jews were exempt from adhering to this law. If you remember the decree from Julius Caesar back around 47 BC, he gave them exemption. They didn't have to have military service. They could engage in their religion freely, and they did not have to worship the emperor. Well, but Christians did not have this exemption. So now we can talk about the people of Smyrna in general, the Jews and the Christians. Well, the Jews and the Christians weren't on board with the heart of the people, but the Jews had an exemption, so they were allowed to have their own religion and so forth, but the Christians were not. So the Christians were completely isolated from everybody else. They were outcasts. If you could go back in time to Smyrna around 96 AD when Revelation was written, what would you see? You'd see extreme wealth, impressive architecture, great performances of music and plays and poetry, advances in diverse academic disciplines, including physics, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. There would be an abundance of temples and shrines honoring Greek gods and goddesses, and many Roman emperors. That's what you would see. But what you would most likely not see, almost certainly not see, amidst those large temples, is a church. Well, at least not a church building. This is because Christianity, as I was just saying, 180 degrees against that culture of that time. Against the law, and against the very soul of that city. The spirit and essence of that city was all on board with worshiping the emperor, and Christianity is not at all. They're all on board about worshiping Jesus Christ. So, how did these Christians worship in this environment? The early churches were probably small assemblies meeting regularly in the homes of certain members. There's a scholar named Saavedra who wrote a dissertation, and that became published as a book in 2015. And he says this. And so I think that makes good sense. So these Christians most likely would have met in secret, trusting each other with their lives. They shared their faith at extremely great risk to the lives of themselves as well as to the lives of their families. In that time and place, there was a trade union for nearly every kind of occupation. Christians would not have been allowed to be in these trade unions. Finding employment, earning a living, would have been almost impossible in this pagan environment. Even if they had set up some sort of kiosk to sell their goods, very few, if any, citizens of Smyrna would have wanted to purchase anything from a Christian. These folks were outcasts. They were derisively derided by everyone in town. These people were fathers. They were mothers and grandparents. And by saying yes to Jesus, they had to say no to certain essential provisions for their children and their grandchildren. Several of these people were imprisoned and executed oftentimes, leaving their wives, husbands, and children with little or no family or means of support. The word translated as tribulation there at the top, you see, is thlipsis, and this refers to the internal pressure of being hemmed in with no possible escape. This was actually a method of torture, would be to place stones on people, and just one after another, and they would just be crushed to death by the pressure. And so this is the type of tribulation that we're talking about here. There were no options. Nothing that they would do would provide any solution to their problem. Hemmed in is a good way of putting it, yeah. The word translated as poverty is ptokeia. Now, this word is much stronger than the word painia, which also means poverty or need. The word ptokeia means beggary. This is extreme poverty. This is having nothing. You have to beg to survive. You rely on people giving you things just so you can survive. Now, can you imagine this kind of poverty in a city with such enormous wealth, prosperity? Just unthinkable. Yet Jesus told the people of Smyrna, these Christians there, you are rich. You're physically destitute, but spiritually abounding. You have the abundant wealth and riches of the salvation and eternal life that I offer you, is what he's telling them. And you can contrast that with the church of Laodicea, who is maybe physically wealthy, but spiritually bankrupt. So I encourage you to take a look at that. Well, in the next part of the verse, Jesus says that he knows about the blasphemy of those who claim to be Jews, but are really the synagogue of Satan. This word blasphemy means slander and irreverent speech against God. I suppose it could be irreverent speech against another person. In Romans 2:28, Paul tells us that hey, not all Jews are real Jews. There's false Jews out there. And so when we're reading about this in verse 9, it's good to keep in mind what Paul said. Most of the Christians in Smyrna, well, they converted from Judaism. Many would have regarded themselves as Jews who believed that Jesus is the Messiah as described in the Old Testament. Many of these Christians would have probably attended the synagogue still. This would have given them a way to continue learning the scriptures and also avoiding that obligation to worship the emperor. So some of the false Jews, here they are in this synagogue with the Christians possibly going to the synagogue. Well, they have a way to find out, hey, that's not really a Jewish person there. That's a Christian. I heard what he said or what she said. These Jews would have had the opportunity to report those Christians to the authorities. The name Satan means the accuser, the slanderer, the adversary. These false Jews were exactly that. They might have gone to the same physical synagogue, but they were not going to the same spiritual synagogue. They were accusers, slanderers, adversaries of the Christians. Their actions were modeled after Satan, the accuser, not of God. So going on to verse 10, fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that ye may be tried, and ye shall have tribulation 10 days. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. Jesus tells them to fear not even one of the things that they will be suffering. He's letting them know that although they are already enduring hardship, well, unfortunately, more affliction is yet to come. He specifies that the devil, the diabolos, which is a synonym for Satan, or the accuser, slanderer, adversary, as I just said, that he will cast some of them into prison. While in custody, they will be tested. God's omnipotent. They're not going to be tested so that God can figure out whether they're faithful to him. They're going to be tested so that they can find out how faithful they are to God. So there are some Christians who were persecuted in Smyrna, many of them, and I can tell you a few of them. I'll just name 3. There was Polycarp. He lived from 69 AD to 155 AD. He was about 86 years old when he was burned at the stake for refusing to burn incense to the emperor. When urged to renounce his faith, he replied, "You're threatening me with this fire? Please, this is just a temporary fire. You have no idea about the eternal fire. So go ahead. I'd rather have this temporary fire." And then he makes his very famous statement here after he's talking about you threatening me. He says, 86 years have I served Christ, nor has he ever done me any harm. How then could I blaspheme my king who saved me? Then around that same time, a young person named Germanicus was martyred. I believe he died also in 155 AD. Now, he was a youth, so probably a teenager. He was arrested and martyred for Christ during the reign of Emperor Antoninus. And since he was so young, the proconsul pleaded with him to renounce his faith so that he could be spared execution. But Germanicus, he didn't budge. He didn't hesitate at all. In fact, once he knew, hey, there's no out here, he actually lured the beast towards himself so that he could be devoured all the quicker and be rid of this life. And so the multitude of Christians who saw that, well, they not just the Christians, I would imagine the other people as well, but the people watching this, remember the wealthy people enjoying the magnificent view of the sea, and here they are watching this young man run at this wild beast and gets devoured. Well, these people, even the non-Christians, would have marveled at his bravery and also marveled at the fortitude of Christians. Well, a good bit later, about 100 years later, there was a person named Pionius, and he died in 250 AD. This guy was tortured mercilessly and nailed to a cross and then burned alive. So those are the 3 names right there. You can see them, and there are many others, and that's just 3 from around that time. As I said, this persecution just became more and more intense all the way into the early 4th century. And so there were many Christians who were incarcerated. They were thrown in jail. They were treated with violence. And then, of course, many of them paid the ultimate price with their life. So I want to continue into the verse here. This 10 days, and we'll get to the crown of life here ultimately. Get some good news for a change. Clarence Larkin, he asserts that the expression about tribulation for 10 days is a prophetic reference to the 10 persecutions, these 10 great persecutions that, under the Roman emperors from Nero all the way up to Diocletian, and this was probably the fiercest time. And it could also refer to 10 years of this really intense persecution under Diocletian. But most scholars, such as Alford, Sweet, Scott, Walford, they agree that Jesus' expression about tribulation for 10 days, it refers to an undefined but short period of time. And he could have been referring to a short period of time that they would have been in custody. During that time, they would be questioned and given a chance to renounce Christ. And there's multiple accounts of the proconsul pleading with Christians to renounce their faith so they could be spared. Jesus told these Christians that some of them would even be put to death. He told them to be faithful and loyal, even unto death. In the second year of his ministry, when Jesus commissioned his 12 disciples to preach the gospel to the Jews, he told them that men would deliver them up to the councils and scourge them in the synagogues. He said that they would be brought before governors and kings for his name's sake. He told them that they would be hated and persecuted, and that brothers, fathers, and children would betray each other, causing some to be put to death. But he also said, "He that endures to the end shall be saved." He didn't say crown of life, but that's what he means. Matthew chapter 10:22, you can read about that. Well, later, right before he was crucified, there he was on the Mount of Olives, speaking to his disciples again. And at that time, knowing that the crucifixion was just around the corner, he told them that they would be afflicted, hated, and killed for his name's sake. He said that many would be offended and betray one another. And this is in Matthew chapter 24, verses 9 through 13. But once again, he also told them, those who endure to the end shall be saved. So he told them that in that reward of the people of Smyrna, he would give them a crown of life. Now, the crown, as I mentioned earlier, was a symbol of the city. That Acropolis on Mount Pagos resembled the crown. It was on their coins. It was a symbol of the city, much as the eagle is a symbol of our country. And so the people of Smyrna, they knew about the crown, of course. Emperors wore crowns. The greatest athletes won crowns for victories in the games. These Christians of Smyrna, they certainly knew about these crowns, but they never would have expected to have a crown made of garland. That's what they were made of usually, let alone a crown of eternal life. Now, can you imagine their reaction to Jesus telling them that he would reward them, each of them? I want to underscore that. He didn't say you collectively. Each one of you, he would reward with a crown, not of just some leaves to go on your head. This is a crown of eternal life for your soul. That's what he said. Well, the verse number 11, we'll get into that. It's also pretty loaded. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. He that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death. Jesus concludes each of the 7 proclamations with the command, he that hath an ear, let him hear. So Jesus is compelling his listeners to pay very close attention to his message. He's saying, he that overcomes shall not be hurt of the second death. He wants them to pay careful attention to that. The word that Jesus uses for overcome is nikao. Now, this is the word to describe the victory of those great athletes that I just mentioned, those great athletes that won crowns of garland. The word means conquer, prevail, win. Now, the way he uses it, nikon, that means the one who is prevailing, the one prevailing. It's in the process of. So he's not saying those who did overcome, who have already done it, he's not putting that pressure on us. As long as you're in the process of overcoming, you're in the process of prevailing to win, you're in the process of winning and conquering. Another way to put it is, as I've said here, you're refusing to yield. You refuse to back down. It's the same word that Jesus uses there in John 16:33, as I've indicated, when he said, "In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world." He wants us to be overcoming. He already has. That's really important. He's telling the Christians at Smyrna that he who is prevailing against tribulation, that is, he who is continually relying on Jesus, who has already overcome, will not be hurt of the second death. That's really good news. And he uses a double negative here I've got for our second bullet point, ou may. This is to emphasize that these faithful Christians will certainly not be hurt by the second death. He's assuring them that they would experience absolutely no hurt whatsoever from the second death. They will experience the first death, that's physical death, but they will never experience the second death, which is spiritual death, eternal separation from God. The church of Smyrna is one of only 2 of the 7 churches that receive encouragement without any rebuke from Jesus. The other one is Philadelphia, of course. So with the remainder of our time, I'd like to get into some application here and offer a challenge. Hopefully this will be convicting to you as it is to me, as I've prepared, studied these verses very carefully and prayed over them and sought God's guidance. So this is a map that I put together. It shows persecutions who are highly persecuted. I think we would say that we have persecution in the United States, but what I'm talking about is highly persecuted, severely persecuted, extremely persecuted. We probably can't even imagine that, so I'm going to help you to imagine that. There are 97 million Christians in China where Christianity is illegal. There, if you're under the age of 18, under 18, you're not allowed to set foot into any kind of a church or participate in any church activities. It's illegal. There are 800,000 Iranian Christians, and all of these folks face intense persecution because converting to Christianity from Islam is illegal. There are probably 300,000 Christians living in North Korea. That's right, North Korea. North Koreans are taught that the Kims are divine beings. So this reminds me of what we said about Smyrna. The people there, well, they worship the emperor. People in North Korea, they worship their emperor, so to speak. And so if the Kims are divine beings, then what's the tolerance for Christianity in North Korea? Absolutely none. It's absolutely not tolerated. North Korea, of course, as we know, has the most ruthless human rights record of the 21st century. If Christians are discovered there, well, they're sent to labor camps or killed. Today, there are about 30,000 Christians imprisoned in these concentration camps in North Korea. There are thousands of Christians in Afghanistan. Converting from Islam is illegal there too, so these people face imprisonment or execution. In Somalia, there are a few hundred Christians. Any Somali suspected of converting is harassed, intimidated, and sometimes even killed by family members or clan leaders. In Libya, there are 36,200 Christians. They face violent, intense pressure from their family and their community to renounce their faith. There are over 4 million Christians in Pakistan. Churches there are heavily monitored and regularly attacked. Churches active in outreach and youth work face even more persecution. Now, I want to give you some more data here. 1 in 8 Christians, that's over 260 million Christians, live in places where they experience high levels of persecution. And if you could go back to 2019, 18, 17, you would notice this is a marked increase. It was 1 in 12 Christians. That's already bad. Then 1 in 10. Then 1 in 9. And as of now, 1 in 8. So it is ramping up, this persecution of God's people. Between 2017 and 2018, 4,136 Christians around the world were killed for their faith. In 2020 alone, 2,983 Christians were killed for their faith. Do you know that's an average of 8 Christians a day killed just for believing Jesus is God? In 2019, 245 million Christians around the world were severely persecuted for the faith. But as I said, in 2020, it's increased 6% to over 260 million people. 2019, 2,625 Christians were detained, arrested, sentenced, and imprisoned, many of them without any kind of a trial. In 2020, this number increased by over 41% to 3,711 Christians. This would be a good time to think about Hebrews 13:13. It says, "Remember those in prison, as if you were with them." So in 2019, over 1,266 churches or Christian buildings were attacked. In 2020, 9,488 churches or Christian buildings were attacked. This is an increase of nearly 650% within only 1 year. Not only are God's people being persecuted and attacked around the world, God's kingdom is being attacked. As believers bought with the blood of Christ, we are citizens of his kingdom. Jesus sends us out as sheep among wolves, in that first commission that he gave back in Matthew chapter 10, verse 16. If we do not experience the threat of these wolves, we better be asking ourselves, what kind of sheep are we? Any of us going about our daily lives, even going to church, singing hymns, reading the Bible, learning about God, yet oblivious and unaffected by these attacks, should seriously beg God to probe our hearts and minds against empty faith. In Lamentations 3:51, Jeremiah says, "My eye affects my heart." We need to see, to perceive, to understand, to be mindful of the reality of these attacks on God's people. These are our brethren, and this is our kingdom. We belong to this kingdom. Think about being a citizen of the United States. If our country was under attack, well, you're a citizen of this country. What does that mean to be a citizen? We want this country to prosper. We want this country we have certain aspirations and goals and hopes for this country, and there's things that we have fears about. We don't want this country to be declining. We want this country to thrive. We're citizens of this country. We don't think that way about other countries, not that we wish ill of other countries, but we don't have those same hopes and desires and concerns for other countries. We're not citizens of those countries. Well, we're citizens of God's kingdom. We should want his kingdom to thrive. We should not want any attacks on his kingdom. We should not tolerate that. We should want his kingdom to thrive, and we should want what God wants. So, as citizens of God's kingdom, we must beseech our King to give us opportunities to support these people, to care about them, to fight against these attacks by many ways. One, we need to be begging God to influence our minds so that we're regularly conscious of this persecution around the world. Another, we need to be praying for our brothers and sisters who endure persecution. Pray regularly that God will give them strength, hope, encouragement, and guidance. That God will use them to advance his kingdom in a powerful way throughout the world. We should want that. 3, we should offer specific prayers, not just pray for those persecuted Christians. No, specific prayers that's informed by our knowledge of the persecution around the world. You know, we make all sorts of time to learn about news involving politicians and athletes and actors and knowing what's going on in Hollywood. But how much time do we spend educating ourselves about the news impacting Christianity around the world? In November of 2020, for example, the president of Azerbaijan, he promised to protect Christian churches when the country, which is 95% Muslim, takes possession of areas formerly controlled by Armenians. Hey, we need to pray that this president will be able to carry out his promise without hindrance. You know he's going to come up with resistance for that. There are 106 unreached people groups in Laos today. The Christians who make up only 3% of that population. These folks face severe persecution, especially in remote villages. Now, the government, they in the past, they've restricted Christian witnessing. Well, they're gradually, it's not great, but they're gradually granting more tolerance for Christianity. And Christianity in Laos has actually increased there recently by 6.8%. We need to pray that this will continue. We need to pray that God will send more of his people to share the gospel to the folks there in Laos. We need to pray for parents in Cuba who are arrested for trying to remove their children from communist indoctrination at school. We need to pray for believers in Nigeria. They were, many of them, driven from their homes and forced into overcrowded camps. And, in that place, the Islamic State of West Africa province, and they're in Nigeria, well, they've pledged to kill Christians. In Burkina Faso, 50 Christians have been killed and 10,000 driven from their homes recently. In 1914, 25% of the population in Turkey, where Smyrna is, well, it comprised Christians. 25% in 1914. Well, today, that percentage has dropped to less than 0.5%. Christians in Smyrna and elsewhere in Turkey are still being persecuted. 2,000 years later, there are conspiracy theories there that Christians collaborate with foreign powers to undermine Turkish identity. Before the Syrian civil war, there were 2.2 million Christians in Syria. Now, there are only 744,000. Christianity is becoming extinct in Syria. There are 202,000 Christians in Iraq. That sounds very nice, but this is an 87% reduction from just one generation earlier when there were 1.5 million Christians in Iraq. Think about this. When Saddam Hussein was in power, there were more Christians in Iraq than there are now. In northern Cameroon, there's a pastor who shepherds a vocal out front church, not an underground church. For safety reasons, he sent his family 6 hours away from there to protect them from Boko Haram. Everyone in town was telling him that Boko Haram they're going to kill you. It's just a matter of time. They're going to kill you. And when he was asked, why do you stay? He responded in shock. If I leave, what will happen to the flock? And not to mention, what about the gospel? I can't leave. What about the gospel? How could you ask such a question? This man needs our prayers. I'm not going to say his name. He needs our prayers that God will continue to use him in that place to keep him safe, not just for his well-being, but to keep him safe so he can keep using him to reach people for Christ in that place. Pray for the family of Pastor Jean-Paul Sankagui, He was martyred in the Central African Republic in 2017. He had started a church there in 1993, and after civil war erupted there in 2012, many Christians fled. But because God called him to that church, Pastor John Paul remained there preaching the gospel. On February the 7th, 2017, a warlord killed him in his home, looted and burned down the church and his home. Pastor John Paul left behind his wife Mary. They'd been married 48 years. He left behind 11 children. He left behind 17 grandchildren. Pastor John Paul knew the danger and the risk, but he also knew the call of God to shepherd his flock and to reach Muslims for Christ. And he decided that answering that call was worth any risk. Pray that God would help us to build strong relationships with church families and Christian organizations in these places, and to use the resources God gives us for helping and supporting these folks. Let us pray regularly that God will help us change our way of thinking, our attitude, and our character by transforming our mind and situating us in an atmosphere, an environment that will allow us to have burdened hearts for our persecuted brethren and for the advancement of God's kingdom to reach the lost for Christ throughout the world. So the ultimate challenge here, I think we should do this. We must do this. We are not God's people if we don't do this. We need to share in the persecution of our brethren, our fellow citizens of God's kingdom, by praying for them, caring about them, having a heart to pray for them, to aid them, to join them as God directs each one of us. And that's the challenge that I have for you today. Thank you for listening.